I want to highlight the word efficient in that title. And let's think through just briefly what that actually means. Efficient isn't necessarily maximum. And so I think sometimes when we talk about reproductive performance in beef cow herds, we get really focused on a number, like for example, a pregnancy percentage or pregnancy rate that we might obtain in a group of cows or in a group of heifers. And we start to think, well, 95% that's good, and 90% is less good, and 85% is sure not good at all. And not that there's anything wrong with thinking about reproductive performance in that way. All of those statistics are helpful in one way or another. But at the end of the day, what do we actually care about? I would sure take a 94% pregnancy rate that I could obtain easily and economically, efficiently, if you will, versus a 100% pregnancy rate that costs a ton of money to achieve. So this is my favorite time of year to bring up this point because MU extension specialists around the state of Missouri work on a cow-calf planning budget, and they also put together backgrounding and stocker budgets and some general budgets for other types of enterprises as well in agriculture. And there's one for Southern Missouri and one for Northern Missouri on the cow-calf side, just because of some differences between those two environments. And I would encourage you, now's the right time, right? With this last year fresh in your mind and with the new year coming up, to really think about cost of production in your system. Because often in a cow-calf enterprise, our main mission really has to be cost control and wise use of technologies and certain costs when they're appropriate and they generate the financial term would be when the marginal revenue that they produce outweighs the marginal cost of those inputs. So I bring that up to say this: the major determinants of gross margin per cow, and that's essentially the profit that a cow produces before we start thinking about the overheads that the whole cow-calf enterprise has. The major determinants of the gross margin that a cow produces are not what we often think that they are. I think we're tempted to think that it's weaning weight. How many pounds of calf does she wean? And frankly, it's not. The major things that drive whether that cow produces much gross margin at all are feed costs. That is the main one, far and away. How much does it cost to carry that cow in terms of feed and in some cases supplementation that the forage requires? And particularly in our state, that cost is winter feeding costs. Days on feed or days on essentially non-grazing days in the winter are extremely expensive. And that is really going to show up in how much gross margin a cow potentially produces. The second point, though, is how quickly does that cow fall out of the herd? How many years does she conceive, calve, and wean a calf before she's culled? And really, that affects this, what I call cow depreciation, which is essentially just like depreciation, that made up word we use on our taxes every year. No, it's, in this case, we're talking about real loss in value of an investment, in this case a cow, over the course of time. And I'll share a little bit more on this later in the talk, but that is a big driver of gross margin produced by a cow. Then we start thinking about things like, age of the calves at weaning. So how early did she conceive during the breeding season, and therefore how old are her calves at weaning? And then things like the quality of the calves, how much growth did they have and pre-weaning growth potential, those things that affect weaning weight. What's their performance like, their carcass merit, potentially depending on how you market them, even things like the visual appearance and obviously the health of those calves. Obviously those matter. But if you look at how much of all of this is really determined by the combination of feed costs and essentially cow depreciation costs that we ought to be thinking about every single year. That is what determines whether cows make money, far more so than the production level of the cow. So this time of year, we're thinking about winter feeding strategies. And as you look around, say, in the next couple of months, and I want you to stop and look at what you're doing and ask yourself if that's really what you wish you were doing. Because our winter feeding strategy is kind of dictated by our spring and summer and fall forage management. And in general, the cow herd management that we have all year long, that's going to dictate what we do in the winter. By the time it comes to the winter, we're at the mercy of our past decisions. But we really have a lot of influence over how long, for example, we can graze inexpensively and keep that cow carrying cost low. And if you think about it, this is a picture I like to use. This is two adjacent pastures that were under identical management 12 months prior. So what's the difference? What do you see on one side versus the other? One has a lot of forage and has a lot of high quality forage. One has essentially very little quantity of forage. And then obviously quality doesn't matter so much when you just don't have anything there to begin with. So when we think about what is actually under our management, what do we actually control? We control a lot about forage quality. We control, for sure, a lot about forage quantity, how much total forage we grow on the operation. And we also control, to some degree, which animals we offer what forage. That part is really pretty easy to control if we manage animals in groups or manage the grazing a certain way. And then when in the production cycle, what forage is offered to which animal. And that's what we're going to focus in on a little more tonight, is when in the production cycle, what forage is offered to which animal. So as we think about the needs of an animal, there's this concept that I think is really helpful called nutrient partitioning. And essentially, that's just a fancy way of just saying that the body has priorities for how it uses available nutrition. So a calorie is not a calorie is not a calorie. It really depends on what context that calorie is given to the animal. And so you can think of this, I like to think of it as say a fountain, right? So if you look at that three-tiered fountain on the right, I can't have water run out into that second tier until that first tier is full. And I can't have water run out into that lowest tier until not only the first tier, but the second tier is full. And that's really the way that the body uses energy in particular as well. And so we have some basic things that we have to do. We have to maintain metabolic function in general, just stay alive. Then the body has to prioritize things like, go and gather food, that basic activity. So I think about, that TV show where they're put out into the wilderness and they have to fend for themselves for a while. If you think about it, they go through this process, right? They have to have enough energy coming in to maintain basic metabolism. Then they got to go gather food. Then if it's a growing animal, that animal is going to allocate nutrient to growth. Then it's going to do basic energy reserve. So bare minimum fat cover. And then it's going to maintain a pregnancy if a pregnancy is already present. Then it's going to lactate. And obviously we're talking about a female in both of these cases, but then we're thinking about moderate energy reserves. And so that might be what we call some basic body condition, right? And then where do we find estrus cycles and initiation of pregnancy, which is what we really need to be, what we really need to have happening this time of year in fall calving cows, for example. That is an extremely low priority of the body, only above the building of excess energy reserves, just putting on extra fat storage. So reproduction, at least in terms of initiating a new conception, is a very low priority for the body. And so we really have to manage nutrition supplied to the animal to allow for that priority to actually take place. So if you think about body condition, and we always talk about body condition scores as just reserve energy on reserve. I think this slide from Glenn Selk's data makes a nice point. We ought to know that a cow that's in these extremely thin body condition score ranges has a low reproductive performance. This is the pregnancy percentage or pregnancy rate that those cows obtain during the year. So for example, cows that were in a body condition score 4, a large proportion of those cows failed to become pregnant. Now we look at our more typical body condition score, or not more typical, but more favorable body condition score of a moderate 5. And we had an acceptable pregnancy rate in this particular case. Now what happens? Well, a body condition score 6, where we've built some extra buffer into that, that shows up in this data as somewhat of an improvement in the proportion of cows becoming pregnant. But with everything, there's this law of diminishing returns, in which case, just doing more and more of something doesn't necessarily yield additional performance. And that's what we see when we begin to move beyond that into these extremely high levels of energy reserves. Say, for example, a body condition score 7 or above, the marginal improvement there is minimal. And so when we're thinking about body condition score, we're not feeding fertility into cattle. Okay, we're allowing an acceptable, I'm going to go back to this here just for a second. We're allowing moderate energy reserves here to be met so that there's enough nutrient, enough water in this fountain to flow down and actually achieve some function on the fertilization and pregnancy attainment pieces that we're going for, essentially the initiation of reproductive functionality at the level of the brain. So why is that important? Well, it's really important when cows become pregnant during the breeding season. And so it's really important that we have some of these basic energy reserves in place, that we can allow that reproductive function to take place, that we can allow the break that is the negative feedback on the brain to suppress reproductive function if energy reserves are too low, or if she hasn't had enough time after calving. We got to get that break taken off. And we do that partly by managing time. We manage the time at which females conceive and calve and then are then re-exposed. And if we do that, for example, a female that conceives very early in her breeding season, calves very early in the calving season, she has enough time after calving that if those energy reserves are met, we have estrous cycles initiated at the start of that next breeding season. But the female, for example, that just calves a little bit later, even if it's what we would often call a well-managed breeding season, she calves at the end of that calving season. There's a proportion of the next breeding season in which she's not even cycling. And if we really mess up the energy piece, that energy reserve piece, body condition, those stores of energy, and we don't have enough water in that fountain, enough energy in that system to actually allow reproductive function like that, we may not even have an opportunity at all. So again, which cow generates the more gross margin every year? Well, it's the cow that conceives early, right? We really need that to happen. And we really need to create a management, a whole management system that is driving us in this direction of early conception as opposed to this direction of later conception. Even if you think, I have a relatively short breeding season, even if this doesn't seem like a long calving season, there's a lot of value to be captured in lower annual depreciation cost of cows and a higher percent of body weight weaned because of the fact that those cows wean older calves simply by managing for early conception. So energy reserves at calving are really critical, particularly for certain females. And so on the left here, we have a little bit of the same information presented a little bit differently. This is how many days after calving it takes for these heifers, in this case, after they have their first calf, to resume cyclicity after calving. So if they calve, for example, at a body condition score 3 or 4, very low body condition score, it takes them a long time to return to cyclicity after calving. Now, a cow really needs to be cycling again at the start of the next breeding season. And if gestation is 283 days, and I add 80 days on top of that, that's right at 360 days. And so you would think, well, maybe that's not a big deal. But when did she calve, right? If she calved at the very first day of the calving season, we have some leeway there, right? But if she calved any later than that, I'm cutting into her opportunities to become pregnant in the following year. And that's part of why it's really critical to manage both ends of this problem and try to manage for females to be in adequate body condition and also to calve early and therefore conceive early and maintain that positive cycle. So this is the same data presented a little bit differently, but if we just look at cows, for example, that start off as body condition score 1 through 3, and we look at what proportion of them are cycling by a given day's postpartum, we have a huge suppression of that female's reproductive function extending out for a large period of time. And remember, over here on the left side, this is average. Well, now you see what the whole group does. And we really suppress reproductive function in those females out for a long period of time. And body condition score 4 is not adequate. I mean, just look at what proportion we've given up that are cycling early postpartum and therefore would have an earlier opportunity to become pregnant if we're not managing to be in this more body condition score 5 to 6 range. So energy reserves at calving are tremendously important. And now I'm going to undo everything I just said. So energy reserves at calving are really important, but energy reserves cost money. And so this concept that body condition score is a reserve is really important, because reserve implies that it's something that we can dip into, right? Reserve is a savings account. And the fact of the matter is there are times of the year in which it is not even profitable to try to meet a cow's energy requirements, to meet her maintenance requirements. There are times of the year in which I cannot afford to feed a cow what she needs because the cost of that feed is too expensive, and it doesn't generate a marginal increase in performance or revenue, I should say, to actually incur that cost. So we need to have this concept of a managed decline in body condition score, depending on the class of the cow that we're talking about and when it is we're talking about that. And so if you think about this, this white line as kind of a hypothetical minimum that we can achieve or minimum that we can sink down to and not have a suppressive effect on profitability in the herd. Well, it's not cost effective to maintain body condition score all year round to be at that level, but it's very profitable to allow some reduction in body condition score, to allow some dipping into that reserve, as long as I don't dip below a line at which it really would have been more profitable to provide some supplementation. And obviously we can mismanage that too and allow this swing in body condition score that pulls cows too low down into these extremely low condition score ranges, where really I ought to have paid for the cost of maintaining those cows in a higher condition, because I actually cut into profitability, right? Some costs are really wise to incur. This is a little bit of data out of Travis Mullenix's group. And I think really highly of Dr. Mullenix. I think he has a lot of good insight. And if you look at some of the work that he's done, in this case, this is providing 2 pounds of supplement versus a 1/4 pound of supplement versus no supplementation. I think this is a really interesting data set in terms of what happens. So look at what happens if they provided 2 pounds of supplement in late gestation. In this case, they were actually able to get those cows to gain weight in late gestation, fairly modest weight gain there. They kept body condition score at calving at 5.1. In that case, they had 95% of those cows that then rebreed during the next breeding season. Well, what happens with let's do this one first. What happens with no supplementation? Well, those cows lost body weight in late gestation. They're actually on a managed decline, if you will. They calve in a fairly thin body condition score in this particular study, 4.5 on average. And what happens? Amazingly, they rescued pregnancy rate, and they did that with management, and they had those cows gaining weight after calving, and that's part of how they did that managed decline. But I think a really interesting story here as well is look at this very economical response that they achieved here of feeding just a very minimal amount of supplementation, what I would call the right amount of supplementation in this case, apparently, to actually cost effectively maintain that body condition score and obviously achieve similar pregnancy rate. They would have to run the numbers in this specific case, but in a lot of cases, you could very much argue that it was very cost effective to maintain that half a condition score in those cows with this minimal level of supplementation. And so they really have to look at what the economics are in that particular situation. So you can do a managed decline in body condition scoring. We just have to be very intentional about who we allow to do that. Mature cows are a very different beast than first calf heifers. They're a very different beast, I would argue, than even 2-year-olds or first calf heifers being 2-year-olds. 2-year-olds after they've had their second calf, so 3-year-olds. That is, first calf heifers and 3-year-old cows are very different beasts than mature cows in terms of their needs. They're still growing themselves. And we can get into a lot of problems if we calve those animals in low condition score ranges. This is a data set I like a lot from 1994. And it looks at, for example, calving these first calf heifers at a body condition score of 4 or 5 versus a body condition score of 6 or 7. And then they overlaid 3 different strategies on top of that. Either they had those cows decreasing in body weight after calving, or increasing at a fairly moderate rate after calving, or increasing at a fairly aggressive rate after calving for each of those condition score ranges. And I think these results are pretty telling. So if for example, a first calf heifer is calved at a high body condition score and is increasing in weight, I think it's no surprise that we have the highest reproductive performance in those cases. If she's increasing in weight after calving and also calved in a good body condition score. What happens if she calves thin and is decreasing weight? Obviously, we know that we're going to have some really reduced reproductive performance. So the interesting pieces of this are in the middle. If we calve in a body condition score 4 or 5, even if we provide a fairly aggressive rate of gain after calving, we do not rescue reproductive performance in these young females. You see that 71% of those females becoming pregnant, as opposed to our more favorable outcomes down here. And likewise, obviously, even an aggressive rate does not really rescue it much over a modest rate of gain. And so there's a lot of really good information as you just think about studying something like this and thinking about, if I calve first calf heifers, for example, in these good body condition score ranges, it changes my management opportunities for the level of feed that I then provide those animals after calving. So I think we have to think about two questions, and I'll turn it over to Eric here in a second for really more of the nitty-gritty advice on how to do this. But there are two big questions. One is, well, at what stage of a cow's production is it easiest to build energy reserves? At what stage is it easiest to build energy reserves? And I think that we know the answer to that question, and it's after we wean her calf off, when she's essentially in that second trimester of gestation. She's a dry cow and has pretty low requirements. Well, it's easiest from a metabolic standpoint to put energy reserves back on the animal at that time because her energy requirements are lower. But we have to overlay that then with what time of year is it cheapest to build those energy reserves. And that's going to be when we can build those reserves with green growing stuff, as opposed to some sort of stored feed or something that requires equipment to go feed and requires inputting, right? So this is how we need to think about managing cow body condition score. We are trying to put on condition when condition is cheapest, and hopefully try to align the stage of production of the cow with the time at which it is cheap to do that. And then we're allowing some level of managed decline in condition and strategically supplementing certain classes of cows. And so we have to triage which cows we actually offer that supplementation to if the forage requires supplementation. And so why would we want to do that? Well, in some cases, we might want to do that because it's just more profitable to invest in supplementation for one class of cow than another. Let's say it's not profitable to supplement old mature cows in a certain situation as opposed to young first calf heifers. That's a common situation where we might want to supplement some classes of cows. Or it could be that we only have so much of a resource and we want to spend that resource on the cows that have the most potential to really benefit from it. And I think about that when I think about stockpiled forage. That is a tremendous resource that we have in the state of Missouri and really across the fescue belt. And if I have high quality stockpile forage, I'm definitely going to be thinking about which class of female I can really get the most bang for my buck out of that resource. There are also cow considerations. What's the variation within that group of females? Am I feeding to the average or am I feeding to the minimum? Often I'm trying to deal with a low end of the cows, and so sorting those cows into management groups can be helpful. I think I already mentioned age, class of cows, and stage of production of the cows. Just want to make the point that a dry spring calving female and a lactating fall calving cow this time of year are completely different beasts, and having these management groups that have combinations of the two of those females are just inefficient, because we are either under supplying the needs of the lactating fall calving female, or we are really oversupplying and really not wisely using the resource on the dry spring calving females. And so that's one big consideration. Okay, this is my last major point. When we think about triaging cows or the needs of cows and allocating the right forage to the right female, a big consideration is not just her needs, but what her value is. So remember, I mentioned cow depreciation is a major cost to consider in the cow-calf enterprise. And if you think about what happens in a female's value over the course of her lifetime, and this is just a schematic, it isn't based on real numbers, but it's based on what often happens in conventional cattle markets around the country. Well, a heifer becomes very valuable up until a certain age, even if she's open. And we can often capture a lot of value just in putting weight gain on even the open replacement heifers if we don't have a lot of cost in a heifer development program. But if we can get those heifers bred, they become extremely valuable as a bred female. And they actually remain fairly valuable, and in some markets around the country are actually more valuable as a bred back 2-year-old cow than they are as a bred heifer. But they're fairly valuable in that early stage of their life if they're breeding in a timely manner, and we could even market those as a bred female. But what happens? Well, as a cow gets out to about 4 to 5 years of age, she starts to decline a little bit in value, and then we really tank in value later in that female's life, until we get to a point at which really it doesn't matter all that much at the time that she's sold, whether she's bred or she's open. If she's an extremely old cow, often those cows, depending on when they're marketed, that they might go to harvest anyway, and we certainly saw that some this year. But think about this: the marginal swing in value of for example, an 8-year-old cow that is open as opposed to bred is a lot less of a swing than a 2-year-old cow that either is a bred back first calf heifer or is an open 2.5, 3-year-old cow. That is a huge swing in value. And it becomes then a much wiser investment to invest the feed cost into these animals to avoid this massive depreciation cost that we would incur on those females by not getting them bred back. And so the point that I like to compare this to kind of a car example, because I think we often think about depreciation with things like a car or some other kind of asset like that. This is a brand new Ford F-250, 2020 Ford F-250 that we just decide to not change the oil in, and we leave it in a pile of burning metal on the side of the road. That's that depreciation loss. Okay, this is my 2001 Ford Ranger that has 220,000 miles on it. Okay, I should still change the oil on it, but the swing in value, if it becomes a burning hunk of metal on the side of the road, is much less. And so if I only have so much oil, not the perfect analogy, but if I'm only willing to invest maintenance costs in certain classes of females, I darn sure want to invest in those young females. And I think that really shows up in the set of numbers that we already talked through. I'm going to hand it over to Eric, but if you're interested in keeping in touch with me, you're always welcome to email me. My contact information is on the next slide, or keep in touch with me on some of these Mizzou Repro channels online as well. Eric, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jordan. Appreciate you teeing it up for me. So my angle to this is going to be more from the nutritionist perspective rather from the systems perspective. And, I've got this picture of, well-managed fescue hay right here with good pasture regrowth underneath it, just to kind of set the stage of, where we're at in our production system. However, there's one point before I really dive into the meat and potatoes of my piece of this talk that I think is relevant to bring to y'all's attention. This chart here, and apologies for just screenshotting a picture off of the internet, but this is a picture of the price of a bushel of corn. Corn closed today at $4.22 per bushel on the cash market. Approximately 100 days ago, on August 3rd, corn was $3.08 a bushel. Okay, so there's been a 30 some odd percent increase in the price of corn in the last 100 days. Now, why that matters is that it's been my experience that the price that we pay for commodity feeds that we might use as supplements for our cows in the winter is intimately tied to the price of a bushel of corn. And in fact, I've seen some anecdotes and heard from some producers who were used to paying, $10 a hundredweight for their 3-way commodity mix that they feed, that are paying $1,300 a hundredweight now, or $13 plus So, the correlation, at least it appears to be there from my perspective. What I'm saying in another way of saying this is that high quality forage is more valuable today than it was 100 days ago. This is a winter where there's a premium on having access to high quality forage to use as a winter feed supplement or to use as your primary forage base during the winter, in particular with your, lactating cows. With commodity prices going up, if we are going to if our system is built around feeding a lot of supplement, significant quantities of supplement, I expect your winter feed bill to go up a fair bit. Yeah, and just to drive the point home is that I think, it's not just going to be corn. I mean, across the board, I believe supplement prices are likely to be higher this winter. Now, where the rubber meets the road in terms of our conversation for tonight is the concept of matching feed with need, essentially. And I like to look at this from two perspectives, from the cow and from the pasture. Okay. Now, I put this picture up here, one, to try and draw these pictures up here, one, to try and draw your attention, and two, to make a point. What is the nutrition of that cow who birthed that beautiful red calf in the snowstorm? Well, she's facing cold stress. We know that that's a time of dormant forage growth across most forage systems. And so, the difference in her plane of nutrition relative to the difference in the plane of nutrition of this calf on the right, who was birthed on green grass, is dramatically different. And as Jordan so eloquently highlighted, we really have a short window of time between calving and breeding to ensure that we have these cows, one, in an adequate body condition score, and two, that they're not going into that breeding season in a steady decline in body condition. Now, I like to look at this from a couple of different graphs. What I've got up here is a graph along the bottom here, the x-axis. We've got the months of the year from January to December. Now, the y-axis is in the metabolizable energy concentration in the diet needed to meet cow maintenance requirements. Okay, so don't get caught up in the numbers on the y-axis so much. It's the shape of the curve, the shape of the line that really is the storytelling piece here. Okay, so we've got the cow requirement on the white line there. Now, we're assuming in this case that she calves February 1, that her nutrient requirements are going to peak somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 weeks to 60 days later, and that they're going to drop off in October substantially once we wean the calf off. Now, this is a classic spring calving scenario. What I want to highlight for you all with this next red line is what the curve looks like for the metabolizable energy content of tall fescue pastures across that same period. Okay. Now, one thing to point out here is that this line is movable. Okay, so this line is not set in stone. We can change our calving seasons. We know that, there's a lot of folks out there who are changing calving seasons from spring to fall and having pretty good success here in the fescue belt. And it's not just here in the fescue belt. All across the country, savvy cattle managers are matching that nutrient requirement curve up with their feed resources, with the forage quality curve, if you will, in their home state. And I learned this concept when I was in graduate school out in the Flint Hills of Kansas, and matching up a different forage type. We went from a winter calving season to a true spring calving season, i.e. calving in February versus calving in April. And we saw a whole host of unintended positive consequences in terms of calving season distribution, in terms of body condition score of the cows, the day that we AI'd them. We saw heavier weaning weights. We saw a lot of good things out of that management change. Now, in the fescue belt, this is what the cool season grass energy curve looks like. Okay, so we're not talking about quantity right now. We'll get into quantity. That's part two of this deal, just from a pure quality standpoint. We know that we have two peaks in tall fescue across the year. We have the big peak in the spring. We have a smaller peak in the fall. Now that corresponds both with quantity and quality. Now the relationship between these two lines is important because when the white line is above the red line, that's a nutritional debt. Okay, so no matter how much of that feed a cow eats, it does not contain enough calories in it to meet her nutrient requirements. The concentration of nutrients is not great enough to meet her nutrient requirements. We in a spring calving, in a winter calving system, we create a pretty substantial nutritional debt going into the breeding season. Now, you can make the argument and say, well, look, the April curve is above the red line is above the white line in April and in May. And you're absolutely right. But, compare the magnitude of difference in the area under the red curve in April and May relative to the white curve versus the area under the white curve relative to the red one in January, February, and March. We've accumulated a substantial nutritional debt right there. And then we are curing that debt with a much smaller change in or surplus in energy in our forage in April and May. And that curve and that debt is accumulating right in going into the breeding season. And so that poses a real challenge. Now, I readily acknowledge that we calve in February in the fescue belt because one, we're calving on frozen ground. Two, we know about the challenges associated with breeding in the heat of the summer here in a 42-inch rainfall area, plus the endophyte and the ergot-like alkaloids in tall fescue that peak in Kentucky 31 fescue that peak in the height of summer. So there's some challenges associated with moving from a winter calving to a spring calving here that we may not see in other states where people are moving their calving season 60 days later in the year. However, if you look at the change in the curve between a fall calving system and a spring calving system, all I've done here, I've changed the shape of the curve by moving my calving date to the start of my calving season is September 1. Okay. What have I done in that order? Now, if you go let's just go from January through December. So we know that the cow is lactating and nursing a calf in January, February, and March, and that we've still created a nutritional debt. However, our assumption here in this is that we wean those calves in April. In reality, we usually don't wean calves until May or maybe even into early June in fall calving systems. But the time we wean those calves, we have a significant nutrient surplus relative to the cow requirement. We're putting condition back on these cows. Furthermore, you'll notice that the cool season forage quality is greater through those summer months and into the calving season. And we actually calve in a surplus in September, and now a smaller surplus, relatively speaking. But you'll notice that, so we've put condition back on the cows, we calve in a surplus, and we create a small deficit, into October, November, and December, relatively speaking. However, the relative magnitude of the debt that we accrue occurs, after the peak breeding season, if you will, in these fall calving systems. And so, in this scenario, if we maintain body condition score going into the breeding season, we get more early pregnancies. We have the opportunity to have these cows cycling on day one of the breeding season. And so, if we incur these nutritional debts in the latter half of the breeding season and in through the dead of winter, it's perhaps that we get these cows bred earlier. We get them bred before that forage declines. And so what I call this is absorbing your nutritional debt with your forage. We incur that nutritional debt at the same time, during those tough winter months, but then we allow that significant increase in the energy content of our forage to absorb those deficits and to put some condition back on those cows without us having to provide significant supplement, which I've already identified as being expensive, especially, expected to be expensive through this winter. So I think this is a nutritional explanation to why we might see some positive outcomes on the reproductive side when we move from a traditional winter calving system in the fescue belt to more of a fall calving system. And really, just to kind of reiterate, the big takeaways here are, not to create large nutritional debts before the breeding season. If anything, try to incur or to create those debts, either in the latter part of the breeding season or even after the breeding season has ended. And more importantly, let your high quality forage build body condition score on thin cows rather than feeding your way into a body condition score 5 or supplementing your way into a body condition score 5. Now, that's been a lot of talk about quality, and certainly quantity is an important component of this discussion. Now, apologies for putting the picture of the hay burners, the pasture ornament horses on there, but this picture really drives home an important point for me. If you can count every individual weed on your pasture or every individual pile of manure on your pasture from the gate, you've probably grazed those pastures too short, okay? And the managing the forage quantity piece of the winter feeding system, can look like a lack of pasture forage. It can look like, poor quality hay. It can look like not enough hay, even if it is good hay. So there's a number of different ways that we can look at this. If you got a hay bale that looks like this, that's essentially buckbrush and sumac that's as thick around as your thumb. The TDN content, the total digestible nutrient content of that is not likely to be very high. And that's likely to not meet the nutrient requirements or the energy requirements of even, a pregnant non-lactating female. I think it's important to identify the limiting nutrients of poor quality hay, though. And really, when it comes down to managing nutrients, the average cow-calf producer should spend more time thinking about energy and less time thinking about protein, minerals, vitamins, et cetera, because if you manage energy in the fescue belt, the protein is going to fall in line because in general, cool season grasses contain greater concentrations of protein across maturity stages than warm season grasses do. A lot of the reason that the feed companies market protein supplementation on low quality forages is because there's a really stark relationship between dormant, low quality warm season grasses. Those crude protein contents can get below 4% pretty commonly. And anytime we get below 7, that's when we create a protein deficiency. It's fairly uncommon in the fescue belt, at least, to see, I've seen a lot of, hay that tests below 50% TDN that will still have 7 to 10% crude protein. So we spend a lot of time talking about protein, but I really don't think that we spend enough time, thinking about how many calories a cow needs in a day. And that's a lot of times what our limiting nutrient is in most of these cow diets, and a lot of the reason that we see, body condition scores slip. And so this is a nice little protein energy checklist. And I just put this up here. So marginal means it's close to meeting nutrient requirements. It might be a little above, a little below. The red X means it's not going to meet the requirement of interest, energy, or protein. And the green check mark means that it will. Now, this is in general. Please don't, assume that all good fescue hay is adequate in protein, or all bad fescue hay is deficient in protein. This is kind of we're just trying to take paint with a broad brush right here. I want to point a couple things out, some high quality feed resources that you might have available to yourselves in the wintertime. Stockpiled tall fescue, cover crops, and then any other cool season annuals, which obviously the cover crops would fall in those as well. Those are going to check the boxes in terms of meeting the nutrient requirements of both pregnant winter calving cows and lactating fall calving cows. And so excellent feed resources. If you have the opportunity to utilize those in your operation, I strongly encourage it. Now, as we get into good fescue hay, that's probably going to be a-okay for, a non-lactating pregnant winter calving cow. Going to be a-okay in terms of protein, but it's probably going to be energy. It's going to be energy deficient for a lactating fall calving cow. Now, what I would define as good fescue hay would be something that tests above 55% TDN, so somewhere between 55 and 60% TDN, and is above 10% crude protein. Bad fescue hay would be anything that tests below 55% TDN, and let's say 7 to 8% crude protein. Corn stalks and corn silage, a couple of other options that might be available to you. Corn stalks, great feed to winter, non-lactating females on. I would not want to try and, breed on corn stalks and nurse a calf. We could do it, but it's going to take some supplement. But certainly if I was going to turn cows loose on, pregnant, non-lactating cows loose on corn stalks, I would expect them to hold their body condition score. Now, there's a lot of green check marks on the last slide. And the reason for that is that, when you think about it in terms of nutrient concentrations, the nutrient concentrations are often adequate. And I like to put it in the context of this pyramid. If feed intake is inadequate, the concentrations of the nutrients above the feed intake on this pyramid are irrelevant because they're not going to consume enough feed to have an opportunity to meet their nutrient requirements. However, if there's abundant forage and cows are not lacking for forage, whether that's hay, whether that's pasture, then we can start to look at, these potential other, pieces of the pyramid to identify any potential deficiencies and seek to correct them. Now, I list energy at the bottom of, or the bottom of the 6 nutrient or the 5 nutrients here, just because, if you cure an energy deficiency, most times everything else above is going to fall in line. And I would only spend much time worrying about, vitamins, minerals, additives, and supplements if I've got everything else in line, just to make the point. Now, forage intake. Forage intake, we can look at it from several different manners. We can look at it in terms of its the relationship between crude protein concentration in the forage and expected forage intake. We know that anytime we get below 7% crude protein, that intake is going to be below 1.5% of a cow's body weight per day, and most likely going to be creating, even though we have an energy or a protein deficiency, we're going to subsequently create an energy deficiency as well. Now, once we get above 7% protein, that protein deficiency cures itself. We could still have the opportunity to have an energy deficiency depending upon the physiological status of the cows. Now, in terms of feed intake, an old rule of thumb is that it takes about a round bale of hay to feed 1 cow for 1 month. Let's assume that round bale weighs 1,000 pounds. If your pastures look like a putting green and you're only feeding a cow, half a bale a month, you're creating a forage intake deficit right there. So that's just a rule of thumb to kind of keep your eye on. And when you get fescue pastures that are, the average forage height across the pasture is less than 4 inches, expect those cows to have limited forage intake, because we know that once we get, below 1,500 pounds of forage available to a cow on a pasture, their intake declines pretty dramatically, especially when we get below 1,000 pounds of forage available to a cow. And, every acre inch of fescue is about 400 pounds of feed. So that's where I like to tell people the 4-inch rule of thumb. When your pastures get below 4 inches, it's probably time to rotate or to make some other arrangements to backfill that forage intake gap. Now, how do I put the nutrient requirements in context? Let's say you've gone to a local extension meeting. The field faculty has promoted the use of forage testing to help dial in your nutritional management program for your cow herd. You can put this into context in terms of TDN, which is energy, total digestible nutrients, in a percentage. You can look at it in terms of net energy for maintenance, that's in megacalories per pound. You can also look at it in terms of crude protein. I like to use 55, 60, and 65 as my rules of thumb from a TDN perspective. And I like to talk TDN because it's pretty straightforward, even though it has some limitations in terms of, comparing TDNs of values across various feed types. These TDN values are pretty conservative. If you're in the neighborhood of those values, you're probably close to meeting nutrient requirements. It's when we get into some of that low 50s to high 40 TDN hay, that we're likely to create a deficiency, an energy deficiency, even in mid-gestation cows. And as nutrient requirements ramp up, with late gestation, when you remember the fetus doubles in size during the last 90 days before calving, and then as we go into lactation, you'll see those values bump up. Now, my assumption here is that these cows have pretty substantial milk potential relative to beef cows, and so these values should be in line, and use them with your extension, with your field faculty, to help kind of balance your rations and to dial your nutrition program in. Now, if I'm going to supplement these mature cows, for me, the first thing is to determine whether they're deficient in protein or energy. This is kind of my low flow chart. The first question I ask is, are they out on pasture still, or are they in a dry lot getting fed hay? The pastures are shorter than 4 inches. Are you putting hay out or not? And then once you've got your quantity issue figured out, then you can decide, well, is the TDN below the rule of thumb? That's an energy deficiency. And even though it's less common, you should also check your forage analysis to make sure that your crude protein values are in line, relatively speaking. And, if they are not in line, I encourage you to consider a supplementation strategy that will allow you to feed somewhere between 1/2 and 1 pound of crude protein per cow per day, depending on their lactation status. If they're, winter calving cows who are pregnant and not lactating currently, and your fescue is 6%, that's 1/2 pound of crude protein. On the other hand, if you're feeding some poor quality hay right now, and to fall calving cows that are nursing a calf and fixing to go into breeding season, you probably better be around 1 pound of crude protein specifically. When it comes to supplementing energy, what I like to tell people, if you're using that commodity mix, if you're feeding them 1 pound or 2 pounds a day of that commodity mix, what you're doing is you're training them to come to a feed bucket. You really need to be thinking about feeding, 4, 5, 6 pounds. I like to tell people, 0.5% of body weight is a great place to start with, especially if I'm feeding some low quality hay and I'm, my cow's nutrient requirements are up. And so, for some big cows, that might even look like 6 or 7 pounds of supplement per day, which sounds like a lot, but understand that we're trying to preserve that body condition on these cows, so that we have that reproductive success. Finally, I'll stop here with a flow chart or a decision guide that was made by Clay Mathis when he was on faculty at New Mexico State University. What this flow chart is it's a nice summation of what I said all in one picture. If you want a copy of this, you can either Google, beef cow supplement decision guide, or just send me an email. My email will be at the end of the presentation, and I'll forward you the PDF. It is available on the web at this site on the bottom right hand. The first place you should start with is, in terms of making a decision in supplement, does she have all she can eat on the pasture? And if she does, then forage supply is adequate. Now, has that forage gone dormant? Basically, what color is the forage? This phenomenon is more pronounced in warm season forage systems than it is here in the fescue belt, because it takes quite a bit to get fescue to go completely dormant and turn brown, completely. There's usually some green even at the bottom, the crown of the plants, most of the year. If it's green and forage supplies adequate, it's likely that even for a lactating cow, there's no supplement required. If it's brown in most cases, then the protein content's going to be limiting. If the cows are in adequate body condition score, think about supplementing them with a high crude protein supplement, and feed that at a relatively modest rate between, a let's say 2 and 4 pounds per day, whether that's distillers grains or something that with a higher concentration of crude protein, distillers grains, soybean meal. You could use gluten, but you'd need to feed a little more of it. All that is to do is to make sure that you keep adequate protein in their diet to keep the rumen active and to meet those protein requirements. If the cows are not in adequate body condition score, then you're going to need to be thinking about a high energy supplement. Our commodity mixes fit really well right in here. And you depending on how poor the condition is, what the physiological status of the cow is, and quite frankly, how close you are to the breeding season, you might need to feed, let's just say, anywhere from, 5 to 10 pounds per day. In this scenario, you've got protein, but your energy is deficient. And so really your metric, how I would encourage you to compare the price of feedstuffs, is to price them on a per pound of TDN basis, and make some decisions, educated decisions based on, what's your cheapest feedstuff per pound of TDN. I'll be honest with you, even though corn price is way up right now, it's likely that corn will be the cheapest per pound of TDN, just because corn is 90 TDN and, your commodity mix is likely 80. Okay. Now, if you go to the other side and the cow doesn't have all that she can eat on the pasture, if she's got some green grass to pick at, or she's got some good hay, in that case, we might need to feed some energy to meet those requirements, but we shouldn't have to worry about protein. It's really when you get into that bottom scenario that says brown, that's really more of a drought condition where pastures are burned up, there's not much forage available, and we are truly drought out, where you might create the situation that both protein and energy are deficient. And so you'll have to take both of those considerations into account.